Everybody, welcome to the Multipliers Leadership Podcast. Man, I'm so excited to be back with you today. Man, we are set up for a captivating podcast as we sit down with my friend Miles Boyer. Miles is a husband, he's a father, entrepreneur, business coach, and happens to be one of the best wedding photographers in the whole world with his work in everything from magazines to appearing in Crystal Bridges Museum. And he continues to do this all while pushing the industry forward and making time to be his son's coach for soccer. And so, Miles, I got to say, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to be able to have you here today.
Dude, thank you. That was the most, if every time I speak moving forward, you could just come with me and intro me, that would be a fantastic thing for me. You know, I feel like we need some dubstep happening in the background. I've never felt this good about myself in my life, Joe.
Hey, I'm with it today. We used to say if we had theme music, that could be a really good thing. If we walk around with theme music, maybe I can be that for you today.
Okay. Can we get you a shirt with my face on it?
No, I'm not going to do that.
Okay. Too much. Okay.
There is a line. That is too
all right.
much.
We crossed it right off the bat. Man, we're like 75 seconds in. We already went over it. All right, cool.
We've already done it. Okay. Maybe a shirt. We'll talk about it. Well, Miles, man, I would love to let our listeners know a little bit more about just who you are. We love origin stories and just kind of the beginning of who people are. And so tell us a little bit about how you grew up, how you kind of got left photography, kind of creep into the picture, no pun intended, to be something you want to chase after and go after. And just let our listeners know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, thank you. Seriously. I mean, first off, thank you for opening this platform and for giving speakers, entrepreneurs, leaders an opportunity for us to talk and share our stories. It's a special thing to be able to communicate with people that origin matters, that like character truly matters, and that when that is shaped and when that's shaped intentionally, God uses that in really kind of remarkable ways. So, dude, I grew up, I'm in Bentonville, Arkansas now, but I grew up in Taos, New Mexico, a little bitty town, kind of right near the New Mexico border. Super artsy family. My dad's an archaeologist, sort of like far too much of an intellectual, the kind of guy that kind of trips over himself because he's too smart. My mom's a retired artist and an art teacher, and so art was instilled very early on in our family as like a priority. Like we weren't forced to be artistic, but we were encouraged to find art in everything. And through that lens and that vein, I was exposed at a really early age to what culture looks like when it's multicolored. And so I grew up in a heavily Hispanic area. I think my high school was like 85% Hispanic or something like that. And that actually didn't include the Native American population. That was probably the other 14%, right? And so the cultural vein of seeing things through fresh eyes constantly was just sort of instilled. And pairing that with the fact that I was one of the only evangelical Christians that I knew until college. Wow. And a lot of my friends were either very kind of like conservative Catholics or Buddhists. Taos is a very kind of like Buddhist centric area. So I ended up having this sort of hunger for a way to express the way that I saw the world, because it just felt different. It felt like my experience looked and felt different than everyone around me. And a camera kind of landed in my hands through a long series of that's a whole story we don't want to dive too deeply into, but I was just aspiring to be like my sister's boyfriend. That's honestly all it was. I just looked up to him, and so he was a photographer, so I wanted to be a photographer. And I ended up taking a job early in high school for a wedding photographer and an architectural photographer. And I after school, he paid me like $10 or $12 an hour, which back then was killer money.
Hey, take that money, run,
dude. Yeah. And my job was to organize his slides. And I ended up doing a really, really crappy job at that. I kind of tore up his bookkeeping and ruined everything. But throughout the course of that, I learned photography firsthand. And it came time for me to figure out what college was going to look like. And I knew a camera had to be involved. Looking back now, I think God had a much firmer grip on me than I realized. And so I ended up going to this cool little Christian school, John Brown University.
Brown University.
In Siloam Springs, Arkansas. I was the one kid that rolled up without chacos on and without a taboo bag. I didn't rock climb, and I just wandered around wondering, what on earth am I doing? Man, that's the origin. I felt at certain times throughout my life for most of 38 years, I felt like I was on the outside looking in. And that camera became this opportunity for me to have like, not just a ticket in, but like a front row seat. Like I got to understand the way people live and think. I got to empathize, and I had tickets to see moments that without that camera, there's no way I would have had access to. And so God's just opened door after door after door for that. And so here we are now, years and years later. Man, I've had the honor, honestly, of the blessing of photographing 600 weddings in like 13 countries and 40 something states. And I just get to serve people for a living, but I get to also train other people to serve people for a living. So, yeah.
Well, Miles, I think we'll dive into that. I think here in just a little bit, as far as even some on that training and equipping others. And I know enough about your story to know, like, I mean, obviously, I knew you during some of those college age, not some of just the college age years, and just as you're aspiring in that season, and to go from that to even just what people see now, they're like, hey, there's a ton of success that you've had along the way, but you've mentioned before, but with both on the podcast, but also as we've talked before, that there's kind of a turning point where you went from, you had a lot of success, you had awards, you had all these things that somebody from the outside would say, that's amazing, that's great. That shifted a little bit from, hey, I want to earn and achieve and do all those things, but you had that focus kind of flip and change more to the people. And can you tell us a little bit more about that journey that kind of changed for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really had to have a number of moments. There's been a number of chapters in my career where I've had to either be told directly to my face by people that I trust and people that I love, close friends, my wife, my family, these like get over yourself moments, where I've kind of struggled throughout most of my life with overcompensating. Like I mentioned, that feeling of like being on the outside looking in, with overcompensating with a lot of ego. And because I'm a pretty type A guy, I have used that ego to force feed all of the awards and all of the accolades, and realized throughout that process that though a lot of those moments have opened doors for me, they've also slammed relationships shut. I've left people in my dust that I didn't want to leave behind, and then there have been other moments that have just been filled with grace, where I've realized and sort of been helped to see that at its core, this job that I've taken on is a service, and it's an opportunity for me to just bless people and love on people, to see them and their lives in a way that I feel like most of my industry forgets. I work in a very vain, very perfection-based industry, and to be able to walk in and sympathize with people and love on them and just say like, hey, whatever is authentic is likely enough in this moment. And those doors have flown open, and given me really more of a voice, more of a platform, more of a chance to affect. And you know what? The compliments that come back from that feed my soul infinitely more than the awards did. To hear from people that say like, hey, just your character is so bold and you're so unapologetic about your belief, like that feeds me so much more. And it's something that I can be proud of, that I can come home after a hard day of work and know that like my kids are seeing getting the best of me, that I'm not just pushing that out into the world, but I'm saving that for my family. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, I think that's great, Miles. I mean, I would love to even just to, I mean, we've got a lot of high performers that listen to this podcast and that we're around as an organization. Man, they are some of that type A. They're achievers. We're going to make this happen. I mean, what would you say to that listener that's like, well, how do I actually shift to be to let some of that humility be there, to just to walk in that versus walking in, man, look at me, look what I'm doing, look how I'm accomplishing. Like, what would you say to that person?
Dude, let me back out and give you sort of a story. So we hosted this large workshop last year called Superhuman, and we started. That's a bold statement for a workshop, right? We started this workshop out by asking people to write down, to take a moment to sit and literally journal what it is that they would be willing to sacrifice for all of their professional dreams to come true. That's a powerful stance. It's a powerful posture to get to, because people at first don't know where I'm going with that. And so they sit and they look at me and they're like, give us some hints. And I'm like, okay, well, would you give up your marriage? Would you give up your future of your children? Would you give up your legacy? Would you give up your bank account or your credit cards or your shopping addiction or your Instagram page? Like, what are you willing to sacrifice for this stuff to come true? And I think that most high achievers assume that they are just the sum of their successes. And so they just keep adding, like, this success adds to that success, which adds to that success, and they keep climbing on top of the mountaintop. And I don't think they realize that the bedrock beneath them is sinking as well. And they're leaving things behind as they succeed. And they are sacrificing. They are giving things up, whether that's just their time or their mental health or their physical health, their spiritual health, it's relationships. There are things that are being sacrificed as they are, forcing themselves to succeed. And unless we're willing to draw that line as to what we're willing to give up and what we're not willing to give up, no success can matter. We have to understand where our guardrails are. So that's what I would tell people is, like, start with a structure, and then when you succeed, and you will, but then when you succeed, you truly understand what to celebrate.
That's really good. I think that it's super helpful, and you're doing something that there's a book by Greg Rochelle that talks about pre-decision and being able to make some of those decisions before you're in that position, because it's really tempting to maybe go outside of that guardrail, whatever that guardrail is for you as well. And I have to use a pre-decision for me for working out, for running, but it's also translate when it comes to the business field as well, and your professional goals. And I would love to even just take a moment and think about your journey as an entrepreneur. And I know there's some things that personally you had to overcome, and you've already talked about some of that, but we see this outside of, like, man, this is great. Like, he's rocking and rolling in this space, in this lane. But what is it that you really, from a pragmatic sense, that you had to overcome to be kind of where you are now? I mean, we go from a kid that's at JBU that has a camera that's trying to be able to just be on the inside to now being able to be invited to, 13 plus countries and all over the world. What's that gap? There's obviously a lot that's there, and you can't encompass all of it, but we'd love to know the gap.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take the camera out of it and let's make it relevant for anybody listening. I mean, that the gap essentially comes down to understanding your value, and it took me a long time to understand that when I am adding value to everybody in the room, whatever room I'm in, whether I'm on the other end of a podcast or I'm at a workshop or I'm just at a coffee shop, if I'm adding value to everyone else, then just by proxy, I become valuable.
100%.
And when I give, all of a sudden, and I don't even know how this works, I've never been able to quantify this, but when I give, somehow I just always have more to give. When I take, all I can do is take. Right? You can't breathe in and breathe out at the same time. So, the gap for me largely became, I had all of these people in the back of my head early on saying, like, there is no such thing as a successful photographer. That doesn't exist, right? Like, starving artist mentality. And then I ended up, fighting that and saying, heck no, I'm going to be the one. Well, then the end result of that mindset is this, like, scarcity problem in your head that that it's like running a race. You feel like you're constantly having to look over your shoulder. And like, you know this, Joe, because you're a runner. You can't race if you're looking backwards.
No.
You can't do it. You have to be the one that's catching up to the person in front of you. You can't worry about who's catching up to you. And so I had to take time, and I'm still learning this perpetually, but I think all of us, because of the culture that we're in, all of us spend an unhealthy amount of time comparing ourselves to other people. You know, I mean, that is the social media toxicity that we're in.
Yeah.
This concept of like every time you open that app as just a release, you're immediately exposed to how much better everybody else is at everything than you are.
Everything, yeah.
It doesn't seem like it matters, right?
100%.
Oh my gosh. And just type in a hashtag. It doesn't matter what it is, right? It's like blowing bubbles. Well, there's somebody out there that's a professional bubble blower and you suck at it. And it's like, you know, running. No, you suck at it. Photography, you suck at it. Dressing, you suck at it. Marriage, you suck at it. The world is so quick to tell you right now that everything that you try, you are going to fail at. And I had to realize that in order for me to be valuable, I had to be the contrast to that conversation. So I had to be the one that looked into people's lives around me and say, hey, you're doing a good job. You're trying hard. I see you. Like, I see your success. I see your hunger. And the more I did that, the more I realized I saw it myself as well. And I didn't need the affirmation. And suddenly I was surrounded by people like you, Joe, but also like Jared, and with like friends of mine that were so capable of looking at me and saying like, wait, I see you too. And the social world, my social world became very small and very tight-knit, but my reach amplified.
That's really good insight to both to be able to say, hey, it's about understanding my value as a person, but also being able to bring value. And Miles, that's one of the reasons that we connect well. And we're not together every day or anything like that, but it's because you have a heart's desire to be able to bring out the best within people, which is how I'm wired. That's also how we're wired as an organization within Multiply Global, whether it's all the way in India or whether it's here in the States. We're saying, hey, how can I bring out the best within that leader so ultimately they can walk in their calling, their gifting, and everything that God's put in front of them. And but I think it goes back to, even as he said, like goes all the way back to the identity of understanding that you inherently, you bring value because you are made in the image and likeness of God himself, which means you already bring value, and so does somebody else too. I think that's spot on. That's super good. I think there's a lot to be able to pull away from that. And, you know, being in the same lane for a while now, I mean, it's over 20 years that you've been in this lane. I say this lane, so it really, you've diversified yourself in so many different ways. And we could go into some of that, but I'd probably get lost in some of the nuance in there. But how do you keep challenging yourself? How do you keep saying, how do I keep it fresh for myself? How do I keep learning and growing? Like, how do you not get complacent and say, you know what, I've kind of accomplished it all. How do you not stay complacent in that?
Well, okay, that's a great question. I should probably back out far enough to say, like, all of these are great answers in theory, and yet, like, just as a man, as a dad, as a friend, I mean, man, I battle this stuff on a daily basis, right? And so how do I not get complacent? Well, I do. I don't know if you've heard the Forrest Frank song. He has some lyrics in one of his songs that says, "Some days I'm Cain and some days I'm Abel."
Yeah, I heard that one. Yeah.
And man, every time I hear that, it sinks so deeply, because it's like, it doesn't seem like it matters how intently you wake up focused on one thing. You know, there will be a challenge there. And so complacency, I think, is probably the one atrophy to your success that is the hardest thing to get out of. You know, you can take time off. I had a great conversation with a guy that I sort of mentor this morning, where he posted just a story, and he used the word grind. Big pet peeve of mine as a speaker and as a leader. And I took a moment to write him and say, like, hey, never use that word. You've got to stop. You have to stop this mentality of like, if it's a grind, you're in the wrong industry. you can't think of that like that. I mean, you have to love what you're doing. And so I guess that would be the answer for you, is like, how do I continually push into new things, is finding what it is in that moment or in that season that inspires me. And, with a camera in my hand, that has changed a lot over the years, because for a lot of years, it was learning how to use that camera. And now that season of life is over, and it's not like adding a new light changes everything. I've got all of that stuff down. And so now it's like, how do I serve better? How do I communicate better? How do I work with brands on a global scale in a way that adds value to them? And how do I speak on platforms and at conferences in contrast what I feel like is toxic without pointing at people and saying you're wrong, But how do I open conversations? And often, I mean, to be totally frank, how do I show Christ in an industry where there is very little room for faith? And not preach at people directly, but how do I open those doors? And that keeps me moving.
That for a minute, Miles.
Yeah,
let's talk about that. Like, what is it? I mean, a lot of our listeners, they're not in a vocational, hey, I'm a pastor or anything of that nature, and when they're in a similar space, they're like, I mean, I don't know if there's a lot of room for faith here. How do you navigate that within your world, and what kind of advice or encouragement would you give to our listener?
Yeah. Well, I think first, listening to the questions that are being asked before you already have a preconceived answer. That's a powerful thing. Our culture is changing. The way the questions are being asked is changing. I think the days where you could have like this evangelistic booklet that says like, hey, here is how to get to heaven. The 7 steps that you need, or whatever it is, right? Those they may be just as true as they've ever been, but they're not relevant anymore because the questions are changing. People want to know, why do I feel empty? Why do I feel lost? Why do I feel like nobody cares about me? Right? Having the opportunity to hear those questions. I had a really interesting conversation on a good friend of mine's Instagram page last week. She's a pretty prolific speaker, and necessarily she has to be cautious how she engages in her comments, because she ends up with a lot of people that say some pretty negative things. Yeah. But I was reading through and I saw a guy that asked the right questions. He is not a believer. He does not know the Lord. He was asking the right questions. How does a loving God allow people to get sick? How does poverty exist? These are great. They're beautiful questions, but I think so often we're so preconceived with our answers that we forget that is a real soul, a real person asking really hard questions.
Yeah.
And walking into our places of work or into our vocations with enough humility to say like, hey, I'm going to listen first. And then instead of trying to act as though I have a solution for your problems, I'm going to be the person, the leader that listens, that appreciates, that understands, and then that adds value where I can, but also gives a lot of grace. And dude, that's Christ. It's like, that's leadership at its best, and if you feel like you need to hit a sinner across the face with your salvation, you need to sit back and mature.
Yeah. I think that's, that means there's ultimately something inside you that says, this is what I've got to do, got to prove, if that's the case. And, in Proverbs, there's a verse, I forget it off the top of my head. I just used it the other day, where it says basically to be quiet. Otherwise, if you open your mouth, you'll prove that you are the fool. And that's the Joseph version. That's not officially translated there. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there in being able to just sit and listen and say, Lord, what is it that they're really asking? And like, even saying like, Holy Spirit, like, give me the right words to say, not just what I'm pre-programmed to say or feel like I should say at that moment in time. And I think that's great advice, Miles. That's really good, a good mindset shift for those that are just working in the everyday and finding that space for faith. And I think maybe two more questions I think we'll have the time for. But I guess I'll start off with even just a small snapshot of a story. You and I had coffee, I don't know, it was a long time ago. we had coffee at Heroes Coffee. We're not sponsored by Heroes, but I'd love to be. That'd be great.
We should be. Jeez.
We should be. Goodness
I'm
gracious.
drinking it right now for what it's worth, Heroes.
You should.
Let's go.
Come on, Heroes. Let's go. Yeah, we can put that in the show notes. But I remember we were standing in line, and there just happened to be another photographer that was in line. And I don't know what type of interaction you guys had before. She recognized you. She asked a couple of questions. And I love you did exactly what you should in that moment. You ignored me completely, and you focused on her and listened to her and what her challenges were, what she was dreaming about. And you asked some really good questions for her as a photographer. Honestly, I think she's one that just got a nice camera and she's just learning and at the very early stages within that. But why, you've touched on this a little bit, but why is it so important for you to make yourself available to, whether it's the younger generation, the up and coming, the ones that are learning? Like, why is that so important to you, to make that time in that space? Obviously within boundaries, but why is that important to you?
Man, think of how many times, maybe as a kid, and maybe, hopefully this isn't just me. I'm about to sound very sad but how many times as a kid where you felt like you were in the way? Now again, I mean, I had there's a lot of complexity to my childhood and a lot that we could unpack. You could have me in tears in a hurry, but there was a lot of time spent feeling like I was in the way. Like my questions were annoying. And I think having enough empathy to see that people often are asking the best questions that they know how, given the information that they have.
Yeah.
And that they'll invest anything that they have, everything that they have, in good advice. Now, as an educator, that's really lucrative for me, right? Like, I mean, I've made a lot of money over the years, frankly, by training people how to first ask the right questions and then how to answer those questions largely for themselves. But just as a person, as a believer, as a friend, I've come to terms with the fact that it takes so much humility to just ask a question, that my stance, my posture in answering that question should have just as much humility. And so just making eye contact with people and giving them the space to not feel dumb in being vulnerable is a big thing. I think often, I mean, how often do you, Joe, and like listeners, you guys, how often are we perfectly empowered to answer our own questions? We just are too lazy to do it. I mean, this is the world of, like, you could solve anything on YouTube, right? I could fix every problem in my house if I would just take the time to watch the videos. But instead, I hire a handyman to do it for me.
Yeah.
People tend to look at me often as a handyman. They want me to just fix it. Instead, often, I feel like there's a lot of power, there's a lot of strength in just allowing them to ask the questions and then sitting back and saying, yeah, well, let me know what you figure out.
Yeah. That's not just good advice for mentoring others, but that's a good advice for your kids as you're continuing to train up your children, whether it's spiritually, non-spiritually, whatever that may be. I want to give you one more here. Miles, obviously even as we watch your social, or even just knowing you, like, your family is super important to you, your business is super important to you, your friends are super important to you. And it seems like everything wants to be, in that category of, high priority. But at the end of the day, like, what do you want to be known for, Miles? Eventually you're going to set the camera down, because you don't want to travel, however many times you have to travel throughout the year. I mean, there's 52 weeks in a year. You probably travel at least 50 times a year. There's going to be a time you're like, I can only do this so much. But at the end of the day, like, what do you want to be known for? Not just from a photographer sense, but as a man, as a follower of the Lord, like, what do you want?
Yeah. You know what I don't want to be known for is being a world famous photographer. I think often it's so much easier to say, where do we not want to be known? Hey, that's fine. Like, it's cool that I've kind of risen to that rank where I have a level of authority in my industry. That's cool. That's special. But it doesn't matter to me. It really doesn't. What I do want to be known for is for the relationships that I've built on the back of that. I was laying on the couch last night. We were talking about this before we started recording. I had a very rare opportunity last night with no practices, no games, no meetings, to just sit with my kids and watch a movie. And I'm laying on the couch last night. I've got my 12-year-old laying on my chest, holding hands with me, and I'm scratching the back of my 8-year-old, and my phone is dinging left and right, but it's on Do Not Disturb, which means that the only thing that could be dinging is my wife, and she's at a dinner meeting, missing us, right? Saying like, hey, I'm having fun, dinner's great, but I wish I was there with you guys. Holding on to those moments, like that's the good stuff. And people will say that and then immediately get back to work. Yeah, sure, yeah, but bills have to get paid, or whatever. But the reality is, like, what do I want to be known for? I want to be the dad whose kid was willing to quietly hold hands with him, even though he's a teenager. Yeah. I want to be the dad that runs the 5K with his 8-year-old, just because I know he can do it. And then I want the byproduct of those relationships to be enough money, enough success, that then I can bless as many people as I can. And that starts with my people. It starts, under this roof, but then, seeing opportunities where I can reach into the industry and serve people better and just love on people. So, and it's amazing that just that stance, just that posture, saying the more I give, the more I have to give. It's an incredible way to just look at relationships. I get to roll into some pretty prolific circles these days, and places that I certainly don't deserve to be. And for whatever reason, I'm the grout that tends to connect a lot of very high profile tiles. And what a special thing to say, like, hey, I may not be the most famous person in this room, but I'm the only one that all of them know. That's pretty cool. So
that's great. That's a great way for us to wrap some of our time. And Miles, I love that, man. Just love how you continue just to grow and develop for yourself. And you can tell that even for me, knowing you for many years, like, there's just so much internal work that you continue to be able to do. And I think that shows on the outside. And you gave us the nugget today that the more that I continue to be able to give, the more that I continue to be able to have. And we echo that within Multiply Global, of not having that scarcity mindset and always believing that there's more that the Lord wants to give along the way. And so, Miles, I want to say thank you. Thank you for jumping in with us today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for continuing to invest into people. At the end of the day, that's what really matters along the way. And we just want to say thank you for being on the Multipliers Leadership Podcast. And hey, listeners, we'll be back in another couple weeks.
All right. Thanks, buddy.